Chilling tales for dark nights.
When I was a boy, I lived with my mother in an old house in Georgia. It was small, and most parts of it were fairly worn, but the asking price was cheap, and we needed a home. It wasn't all bad, though. The place had a pretty large backyard and acres of woodland behind it. On one particularly hot summer day, I was sitting inside playing with my dog, Marley, as my mother was leaving for work and discussing the usual guidelines to the babysitter. "I'll be back around 11, I remember her saying. "Make sure he's in bed by 10. The babysitter nodded and smiled as my mother called goodbye to me and shut the door. Now it was just me, Marley, and the babysitter from down the street. "I'm gonna run a couple of errands," said the babysitter, to which I nodded without looking up. I suppose here is where I should mention this babysitter was an asshole. After my mother would leave for work, she would politely excuse herself from the house, returning just in time to collect up pay. I never complained, however. I wasn't ever afraid of being alone, and what kid doesn't like having no rules for a while? I spent most of the day playing Game Boy or chasing Marley around the house. When the sun fell, it came time for my favorite summer activity, catching fireflies. I couldn't tell you why, but I was just so fascinated by fireflies and liked to keep them as pets. I grabbed an old mason jar from under the sink and left through the squeaky screen door to the back porch, Marley following at my heels. I was greeted by the overwhelming sound of insects buzzing all around the backyard. I walked down the wooden steps of the deck and began my search for fireflies. I looked for the faint glowing lights for what felt like hours, shuffling through the grass in the warm night air. Suddenly, I saw it, the biggest firefly I had ever seen, blinking around the old rusted chain-link fence in the very back. With jar in hand, I whipped after it, Marley barking after me. I had soon made it to the fence when the firefly began to retreat into the woods. I wasn't about to go back empty-handed, so I climbed over the fence with a bit of struggle and into the woods. Marley whined on the other side as I walked past old, mossy trunks, leaves crunching under my feet as I went, following the glowing yellow light. The woods felt like I had stepped into another world. The trees were enormously tall, and the leaves atop shrouded any moonlight from entering. Just as I was beginning to feel I had gone too far, I looked back to find the shining porch lights of my house, but I could not see any trace of them. I had been engulfed by the woods. I couldn't hear the buzzing of insects anymore. It was silent now. I looked forward again to find the firefly drawing closer. I needed to catch it now, if only to use it as light to find my way back. I swooped at it with my jar and caught air. Startled, the firefly began to float upwards, blinking its yellow light as it went. It kept going higher and higher out of my reach, and I followed it with my eyes. It drifted up the high timbers, and suddenly I saw everything. Bodies. Hundreds of twisted bodies. Men and women, boys and girls, strung up like puppets in the branches, illuminated only by the light of the firefly. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. I could hear everything, the creaking of the ropes, the moaning of the old trees, and the footsteps close by. I ducked behind a tree, trying to quiet my harsh gasping. I had gone too far, I thought, and now I was going to live up there as another puppet. I didn't know what to do, whether to run or wait, but the footsteps were growing closer. It knows I'm here, I thought. There was no way it couldn't have heard me coming. Mustering all my courage, I shoved off from the tree and bolted toward the direction I came, whipping up leaves as I went. I could hear it giving chase behind me, its feet pounding the earth rhythmically as it went. I ran faster than I had ever in my entire life. I couldn't stop the tears from streaming as the wind slapped against my face. I hadn't even said goodbye to my mother when she left. As I had hoped, the lights on the back porch were shining through the dark ahead of me. I could hear Marley barking, and I knew I would soon meet the old rusty fence. I remember thinking that climbing the fence would slow me down, but it was the only way. The trembling earth was growing closer, and the tip of my shoe caught a root and I slipped, landing on my stomach. I fumbled over onto my back and began kicking away from the faint outline, getting closer. I gripped my mason jar and threw it as hard as I could into the black wood. I heard a thud and got to my feet. I met the fence and vaulted into my backyard. I screamed for my dog, and we rushed up the back deck and inside, locking the door as we rushed through. I sprinted upstairs to my room and took Marley with me, locking the door and pushing a chair against it. I collapsed onto my bed with the lights on, my mind racing. I checked the clock. 10:33. Relief washed over me. I was safe now, and soon Mom would be home. Perhaps it was the adrenaline leaving my body because I suddenly grew very tired. I didn't want to sleep, but I couldn't fight it. I passed out in my bed with the lights on and Marley by my side. I awoke, suddenly, in the night to a pitch-black room. The covers were over me, so I'd guessed my mom had gotten back and checked in on me. I was sweating under the warm comforter and turned on my other side. And that's when I saw it. A face, inches from my own, with bone-white skin stretched tightly over its skull. Its tall, thin figure was hunched and bent over my bed. Its lidless eyes watched me, studying me. I wanted to recoil at the sight of it, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, everything changed. I woke up gasping. The lights were on in my room and the chair was still pushed against the door. Marley lifted his head and looked at me. My eyes drifted to the clock. 10:46. I heard the doorbell ring, and I ran downstairs to the front door, wrenching it open and falling into my mother's arms, crying. And now here I sit, 10 years later to the day, in a lobby crowded with people because I can't stand to be alone. I remember my mother traveling into the woods the next day against my wishes, only returning to say she didn't see anything. My brain had played tricks on me in the dead of night, she said. I didn't believe it at the time, and I don't now. There isn't a night that goes by that I don't think about it. That one night I'll wake up and see that horrible face again, and this time it won't be a dream. What scares me most is the thought that on that warm summer night, 10 years ago, I was the one that got away. The pet it didn't get to keep.
The Last Halloween, written by William Dalphin, performed by John Evans, featuring Brindolyn McNair, Aiden Ordover, and the cast and crew of the Simply Scary podcast. I don't celebrate Halloween. When the trick-or-treaters come out and start prowling my street, I make sure to keep my front porch light off and pull the shades down. If someone rings my doorbell despite all my precautions, I hide in the bedroom and pray that they don't ring it again. There's always a fear that maybe it's not a child in a Ninja Turtle mask or wearing a sheet over their head. Maybe, just maybe, it's Granny Clark. Granny Clark is the reason I stopped celebrating Halloween. Abigail Clark, known to everyone in Hollisfield as Granny Clark, was the kindest, sweetest old lady in existence. She lived in a little green house at the top of Tamarack Lane, one that bordered a broad expanse of forest. She'd lived there as long as anyone could remember. Someone once told me she was over 100 years old, and nobody within earshot challenged the claim. I absolutely believed them. Juniper Street, the street I lived on, just happened to touch that same forest as Granny Clark's. There was a path that wound through the woods all the way up the hill to her driveway. Many an afternoon was spent playing in those woods, climbing trees, building forts out of sticks, or running down that winding path from Granny Clark's driveway to the end of Juniper Street, pretending wolves were biting at my heels. I always felt somewhat unnerved being around Granny Clark. Maybe it was the way she walked, all hunched over, her arms bent at the elbows like a tyrannosaurus. Or maybe it was her shock-white hair that stuck out in all directions. Maybe it was the way I could see her blood vessels clear as day through her translucent, liver-spotted skin, the way her fingers seemed unnaturally long and thin. My mother took me to see her once when I was 7. They were coordinating together on an arts and crafts table at the local fair. I remember that her little green house smelled like lavender and mothballs, and the rooms were lined with photos of children. Some of the photos were in black and white or faded like they'd been taken many years ago.
Are these all your kids, Miss Clark?
She smiled and looked around the room.
These are all my lovely babies.
Afterwards, as my mother and I walked down the path to Juniper Street hand in hand, I told her how amazing I thought it was that one person could have so many children. She just laughed at me.
They aren't really her kids, Will. Miss Clark doesn't have any children of her own. Those were photos of other people's kids.
Why does she have photos of other people's kids?
Because their parents gave them to her.
Did you give her my photo?
Not yet.
I looked up at my mother with concern.
Please don't.
She frowned, but said nothing the rest of the walk home. 5 years later, I got permission to go trick-or-treating with my friend Spencer on Halloween. Spencer lived over on Rosemond Avenue, a street which connected with a number of others, including Tamarack Lane. The neighborhoods over and around Rosemond were considered the best area for trick-or-treating in my town, far superior to the neighborhood down around my neck of the woods. Together, we convinced both our parents that we were old enough to go on our own. What I didn't know at the time was that Spencer had other plans. When my dad dropped me off at Spencer's doorstep in my pirate costume, complete with eye patch, black marker goatee, and stuffed parrot velcroed to my shoulder, Spencer was already outside, sitting on the front stoop. He was going as either a zombie or an accident victim, I never really asked. His clothes were all torn and covered in stage blood, and he'd used some sort of wax to create open sores on his arms and face. I was genuinely impressed with the amount of work he'd put into making himself look grotesque. Once my father's car rolled out of sight, Spencer grabbed me by the arm and hauled me around the side of his house to the garage.
Listen, Will, you have to help me pull something off. It better not be your pants.
Spencer gave me a serious look.
Ha ha. Josh dared me to prank old Granny Clark.
Josh Gurry was a kid in our grade who Spencer had a habit of butting heads with. They'd had a rivalry ever since Spencer pinned Josh in under a minute during gym class wrestling. Since then, Josh always tried to make Spencer look weak in front of the other kids our age, and Spencer refused to ignore it whenever he did, probably as a matter of pride.
Granny Clark?
I didn't like the idea of doing anything to anyone, let alone an elderly person. Spencer saw the concern in my eye.
We're not gonna do anything serious. What were you planning?
Spencer smiled.
It's simple. You distract her by trick-or-treating at the front door. Just keep her talking. I'm gonna go in the back.
No way! I'm not going to be an accomplice in breaking and entering.
It's not breaking in, Will. She always leaves her back door unlocked.
That seemed like an odd thing to know.
Anyway, I'll go in the back, sneak upstairs, and toilet paper her entire bedroom.
As if to prove the legitimacy of the plan, Spencer pulled a large roll of bathroom tissue out of his trick-or-treat bag.
What will that prove to Josh? That you can TP some half-blind old lady's house?
Are you gonna help me or not? Because you can always walk home if you want.
We stared at each other through our makeup effects for a few moments before I sighed and gave in.
But promise we'll do a bit of trick-or-treating too. Otherwise my parents will know we're up to something. Of course, I want candy too. Jeez.
With that, we set out. Trying not to seem obvious, we meandered around the neighborhood for a half hour, letting the sun set and waiting for most of the other trick-or-treaters to finish going down Tamarack Lane, trying to reduce the chances of someone spotting us. I got some candy to get started on my alibi in case I was questioned later as to my involvement in scaring an old lady to death. My stomach was very unhappy with me, and it made it known by clenching up like a fist. I was hot in my pirate costume, but my whole body shook with anxiety. Finally, when the streetlights had turned on, and all the very small goblins and fairies were carted off back to their homes, Spencer nudged me in the ribs and nodded silently in the direction of the forest. I nodded back, and we made a beeline for Tamarack Lane, trying to make small talk to continue looking inconspicuous. When we got to the end of Tamarack Lane, Spencer threw his arm out, stopping me in my tracks. We both stood, looking at the little green house at the top of the hill. The front porch light was off.
No! Welp, she's in bed. Abort mission.
I started to turn when Spencer grabbed my arm.
Wait. I think I see her moving about in the kitchen.
There was someone moving around in the kitchen. I couldn't make out who, it was just a silhouette pacing around in the back of the house, right near the door Spencer was planning to sneak in through. Spencer reached into his trick-or-treat bag, fumbling around for a minute before pulling something out and shoving it into my chest.
Here. Take this.
I took what he handed to me and looked down at it.
A walkie-talkie? Are you serious? Stick it in your candy bag, then go ring the doorbell. And if you can't keep her busy, just reach in and click the button on the front twice. I'll hear it and bail. Dude, the porch light is off.
Spencer looked at me, and I saw the desperation in his eyes. He had to prove himself to Josh in this stupid, juvenile, ridiculous way. And if I didn't help him, he was probably going to do something even dumber. Or worse yet, in his mind, go back to school and confess to Josh that he didn't do it. I sighed and dropped the walkie-talkie into my bag.
Just go and get it done quick. Granny Clark gives me the creeps.
Spencer ducked down low and crept off into the trees and bushes by the side of the road. He was out of my sight in an instant, though I heard him shuffling around, snapping twigs and cursing as he stumbled through the dark. And then he was gone. I looked up at the little green house. It seemed bigger and a darker shade of green than it had before, though I knew it was more my mind playing tricks on me than anything real. Through the window, the silhouette of Abigail Granny Clark shuffled around in her kitchen, occasionally disappearing out of sight around the corner, only to shuffle past in the opposite direction a moment later. I ascended the front porch steps, my right hand sliding into the candy bag to feel the walkie-talkie and make sure it was face up for easy access to the emergency button on the front. My pirate makeup was probably starting to run down my face due to the sudden sweat I'd built up on my forehead. The stuffed parrot on my shoulder felt like it was getting heavier. Somewhere, deep inside me, a little voice whispered, "I don't want to be here," over and over again. I felt certain I was going to hurl at any second.
Time to man up or shut up.
I hesitated to push the doorbell button. Trembling in fear, my finger hovered there in front of it for a solid minute. My heart lurched at the sound of the walkie-talkie. I clutched my chest and gritted my teeth, knowing Spencer was sending me a signal.
Okay.
As I approached the door, I became horribly aware of the sound of banging and thumping inside the house. I rang the doorbell. The sound of busy work inside the house stopped suddenly, and silence settled over the house. I wondered if I should ring the doorbell again. The sound of their approaching footsteps served to fill my tankard of dread even further. There was a hesitation in them, like Granny Clark wasn't sure what to do. Or maybe she was waiting to see if I'd leave. I found myself hoping she would open the door. I really didn't want to have to ring the doorbell again. Just then, the porch light came on, and I froze. It was like being cast suddenly in a spotlight. There I was for all to see. Through the small, semicircular window in the door, I caught a brief glimpse of someone looking out to see who had rung the bell. I couldn't make out her eyes, just her eyebrows in the darkness. With the door open, I found myself face to face with Abigail Clark. She looked haggard. Her eyes were sunken and hidden in shadow. Her features were even more pale than usual, and her whole face seemed to hang off her skull. She had pulled a shawl over her head, hiding most of her shock-white hair. I could only see a few strands hanging down in her face. I swallowed the lump burning in my parched throat. When I finally found the courage to speak, I squeaked out the words,
Hi. Trick or treat.
Granny Clark didn't say a word. She just stood there, not moving, staring at me with her dark eyes and that sickly-looking face. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement behind her in the kitchen, and I knew Spencer had entered the house. I needed to fill the silence or he'd be busted for sure. I blinked several times trying to think of something to say.
Miss Clark, I'm sorry if I woke you.
Oh no. I realized I'd said we.
My mother insisted I stop by and say hello while I'm out trick-or-treating tonight, and I almost forgot it. I knew she'd be disappointed if I went home tonight and told her that I hadn't paid you a visit, so I'm hoping despite your light off, you'd be...
Granny Clark stepped halfway out onto the porch. As she did so, I noted the heavy brown coat she wore. I also noticed a pair of thick gloves on her hand. She seemed to straighten and turn, reaching behind the door jamb for what I assumed was a bowl of candy.
Are you having trouble with the heat in your house, Miss Clark?
I could hear myself, and it sounded like I was going to cry. Why wasn't she speaking? One gloved hand beckoned me closer. Her every exhalation gurgled like a diver using a snorkel. The expression on her face never changed. There was no sign of the joy or excitement that I'd seen every time I'd visited her in the past. She seemed like an entirely different woman, and I felt sensations of discomfort and fear battling each other in my gut. I stepped closer, holding my bag out. A disturbance in the back of the house broke the awkward silence. Granny Clark and I both stiffened. Oh no, I thought. Granny Clark turned her head in the direction of the kitchen, where Spencer seemed determined to make as much noise as he possibly could. It sounded like he had started having a seizure back there and was flopping around on the kitchen tiles, slapping everything in sight. Panic lurched in the pit of my stomach. It felt like my eyes were going to bulge out of their sockets as I tried to think of anything to say in this situation. My mind blanked with the single word, "Go," flashing like a neon sign in the center of my brain. Without another word, I turned away to make a hasty retreat. Granny Clark's heavily gloved hand clamped down around my wrist. For being over 100 years old, she had a grip like a lumberjack. She squeezed so tight my legs turned to gelatin, dropping me to my knees. I cried out in pain as I grabbed at her hand.
Ow! Miss Clark, you're hurting me!
Her other hand behind the door jamb appeared, holding not a bowl, but a large box cutter. She extended the blade, looking at me with the same emotionless expression, and pulled me closer to her. The whole moment was so surreal that I just knelt there on the front porch as she dragged me towards her, trying to understand what was happening. Why was she holding a box cutter? Where was the candy? What was going on?
Run!
Granny Clark turned again in the direction of the kitchen as she caught sight of Spencer dashing past, throwing open the back door and disappearing into the backyard. In doing so, her grip loosened on my wrist ever so slightly, just enough for me to twist my arm and squeeze through her fingers. She turned back to me, grasping at me with her free hand, while the other one, holding the box cutter, arched back threateningly. Even then, kneeling on the porch, watching the kindest old woman in town come at me, the blade of the box cutter glinting from the streetlights, I tried to rationalize the situation. This wasn't the Granny Clark I knew. I looked up at her, trying to find the words to calm her.
Please, Miss Clark, don't kill me. It was just a joke, I'm sorry, please.
I scrambled back a foot. The left half of Granny Clark's face seemed to sag like it was melting. Her eyes looked funny, droopy. She brought the blade down, and I instinctively raised my hands to protect myself. The edge of the box cutter sliced through the fabric of my costume and opened the flesh of my arm. I did not give her a second chance. My legs that had initially surrendered to gravity now felt the intense burn of adrenaline pumping through them. Tucking into myself, I rolled backwards, trying to gain my footing, only to end up tumbling down the front porch steps instead. White-hot pain shot up my left side, but I refused to pause. I was too driven by blind panic. I got to my feet in a hurry as the old woman on the porch straightened up, towering over me like a giant. Granny Clark tromped down the steps with a frightening determination. Spencer, eyes wide with terror, came around the corner of the house at full tilt. He surveyed the scenario unfolding on the front porch, and a look of confusion washed over him for a second, before he grabbed me by the arm and spun me around.
Make for the woods!
And with that, Spencer was off like a shot, sprinting to the end of the driveway where the forest began. I ran, hot on his heels, my arm and my head both throbbing. Dizziness and nausea swept over me, and I tripped over my feet, colliding with the side of Granny Clark's car. How had everything gone so wrong? Before I could collect my thoughts, I heard the heavy thud of boots and, looking back, saw Granny Clark's hulking form lurching towards me. Silhouetted by street lamps and her heavy coat with a shawl over her head, she looked massive like a lumbering horror, hell-bent on my destruction. Nobody's gonna believe this, I thought. Even I don't believe it, and I'm seeing it. I shook it off and bolted for the tree line. I knew that if I could just make it to Juniper Street, I'd be safe. The trail was a winding quarter mile, but it was all down a hill, and I had enough terror-based energy pumping through my veins to keep me going. I'd run that path for years, and I knew every gnarled root that might trip me up, every change in the angle of the descent, every curve to avoid a tree in the dark. Just get home. The moon was out, and it filtered through the branches, making beams in the dust kicked up by Spencer before me. It highlighted the path and cast the forest in a creepy blue hue. Everything around me seemed to glow. If I hadn't been running for my life, I might have stopped to take it in. The adrenaline coursing through me made time slow to a crawl. Every footfall felt like I was slogging through thick mud. I've never been as perfectly attuned to my senses as I was sprinting through the forest that Halloween. I could hear everything around me, my breath coming out slow and focused, my heart thumping in my ears, the snapping of branches further down the path as Spencer, less familiar with the way, ran ahead, and the heavy clumping of someone coming down the trail behind me. I turned to look. I did it, knowing all the stories of people being told not to look back and all the bad things that happened to them when they did. I did it, not wanting to see what it was because I knew. I did it, and all my hopes of making it home disappeared in a flurry of wings like a flock of startled pigeons. Granny Clark was right behind me, thundering down the trail like a rampaging elephant. She was a good 20 paces back, but I could see her perfectly in every sliver of moonlight we both ran through. The most frightening thing about her was the look on her face. It wasn't one of anger, or even of determination. In fact, there was no expression whatsoever. Her eyes were dead. Her mouth seemed to hang open. The left side of her face still sloughed down like melting candle wax. And then the wind whipped her shawl off, and her face went with it. It just slid down as easily as a Halloween mask, disappearing somewhere on the trail behind her as she closed in behind me, as determined and frightening as ever. Where the face had been, there was just blood everywhere. But I could finally see her eyes through it all, and they stared at me with a terrible rage and madness like I had never seen before. I thought I was going insane. She bore down on me, the sight of her hate-filled, bloody face burning forever into my mind. Her hands reached out, trying to grab me and guide me to hell. But all I could focus on was that scarlet face, the true fury within her finally revealed. There was a sharp turn in the path, and I slowed for only a fraction of a second to make it. Granny Clark was not as familiar with the trail, her momentum driving her straight on. Her fingers licked past the back of my head and wrapped around the stuffed parrot on my shoulder. She can have the parrot, I thought. She tore it off just as she barreled headlong into the trees behind me, crashing to a stop with violent abruptness. When I burst out of the woods and onto the tarmac of Juniper Street, I was moving like all hell was on my heels. Ahead, I saw Spencer slowing down, trying to catch his breath as he reached the driveway to my house. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost his own trick-or-treat bag, and most of his makeup had run off.
Don't stop!
He turned, seeing me hurtling down the road, and hurried up to the front door.
Let me in! Let me in! Open the door, please! Let me in! Help!
I dashed up the front sidewalk, shoving him aside and throwing my shoulder into the door, having just enough sense to turn the knob and open it. We fell over each other on the landing, and Spencer kicked futilely, trying to close the door behind him. I climbed over him to get to the door. With my full weight against the door, I broke down into tears while clutching my arm.
Oh my god! This is all your fault, Spencer! You and your stupid ideas! I never should have gone along with it. Whatever, Will. You outed me when I was in the back. Everything was going fine until you had to go and screw it up. Me? I can't believe you! It's you that almost got us killed! You and your stupid schemes! I'm so sick of you, Spencer! I'm sick of you! We're done, Spencer! I don't need friends like you! Fine! Good riddance!
My mom and dad, hearing the commotion, ran in from the living room to find us yelling and bloody. They looked us over with mild annoyance until my mom saw my shirt soaked red with blood and her eyes bugged out.
What the hell happened?
My mind retraced through everything that I had just witnessed.
Her face. They took her face. It came right off.
Both my parents looked equal parts concerned and utterly perplexed. I could tell they thought we had just spooked ourselves and gotten hurt running away. I waved my hands at Spencer to silence him and then told them everything. As my story unfolded, their expressions wavered between doubt, anger, and concern. Honestly, telling them that Granny Clark had attacked me with a knife and then chased me through the woods before her face peeled off, I had a hard time believing it myself. When I finished, Spencer told his side.
When I went through the back door, I should see Will and what I thought was Granny Clark at the front door. I tried to creep around the stairs, but I tripped over a pair of legs. Miss Clark's legs. She was lying in the food pantry.
I'd never seen Spencer cry before, but his eyes welled up with tears as he continued.
Her face was missing. I could see all the stuff underneath. They had pulled it all right off, just like peeling an orange. They took her face.
My mom disappeared into the kitchen where I could hear her using the phone to call the police. My father stood there shaking his head in disbelief at us. Spencer and I locked eyes.
It wasn't Granny Clark on the porch, Will. When I realized that that's when I told you to run. I'm so sorry.
I hugged him, forgetting the pain in my arm for a moment as he balled his fists up in my shirt and buried his face in my chest, adding his tears to the blood and sweat that I was thoroughly soaked in.
I'm so sorry.
When the police got to Abigail Clark's house, they found her just as Spencer had described. Her throat had been slit, and all of the flesh on her face had been removed. In the woods, they found the remains of her face, cut from ear to ear and worn like a mask. They also found my stuffed parrot lying in the leaves by a blood-covered tree at the turn that had saved me. One of the branches on the tree was snapped and dripping with blood. Even more was found where the path opened out onto Juniper Street. But after that, the trail went cold. They found the killer a day later, an unemployed carpenter from 2 towns over with a history of violence. He checked into the hospital with a gouged-out eye, claiming he had accidentally impaled himself while hanging a picture. Apparently, his blood work came back with 2 different types on him, one of which was identified as Abigail Clark's. Thankfully, he confessed, saving the police from having to ask Spencer or I if we could identify him. Neither of us would have been able to, and neither of us wanted to ever see him again. I do see him, though, regularly, whenever the scar on my arm flares up and my dreams turn to running down that moonlit trail in the woods with him just 10 steps behind me. Of course, the face I see isn't his. It's always Granny Clark's face, devoid of emotion, yet every step filled with anger, determined to catch me and put me in the ground. Granny Clark, the most beloved person Hollisfield has ever known, is the monster that haunts my worst nightmares.
The Crawlers. Written by Jimmy Juliano. Performed by Joseph Gable. I've never told this to anyone out of respect for my friend Mike. It happened 20 years ago, but I think about it often. When I'm up late at night, my thoughts will drift away, and for a moment I'm a carefree kid with no worries and a wild imagination. As an adult, there are all sorts of rational answers to what transpired, but I've never quite latched onto one as the answer. But even though there are a dozen possible answers to what happened to us as kids, it all started with a single question. Have you seen the Crawlers? I was 10 years old at the time, and no, I hadn't seen the Crawlers. I didn't know what my friend Mike was talking about. He shoved his hands in his pockets and shifted his weight from foot to foot. He was talking faster than usual. Mike was certainly excited to tell me and our friend Tommy about the Crawlers, whatever they were. They are creatures that only come out at night, Mike insisted, and they don't come out all the time. If you see one, it will be slowly crawling through your yard, but only when it's really dark out. They don't want to be seen. It was a lazy summer afternoon, and we were just 3 kids wasting time on our bikes in a safe and relatively boring subdivision. Nothing should have creeped me out at that moment, but the term Crawlers immediately gave me a case of the willies. The good kind of willies. The Crawlers sounded creepy, and I loved anything creepy. There's only 3 rules if you see a crawler, Mike said. Number 1, don't shine a light on a crawler. If you do, it will sneak into your house and kill you. I nodded and smiled. Tommy just rolled his eyes and shook his head. I looked down on Mike as he told his story, but not in the lack of respect sort of way. It was the literal sort of way. I was 8 inches taller than Mike. The doctor said that Mike was in the 1st percentile for height or something like that, and he might only ever grow a few more inches in his entire life. Tommy's parents once told us that Mike liked to make up stories to compensate for the fact that he was done growing, and was such a weakling. I found that kind of mean. Number 2, Mike continued. If you go out to meet a crawler, you have to keep your eyes shut. Don't look at it. If you do, it will kill you and take over your life. It will mimic you. He paused and thought about it for a second. But I'm not sure about that one, Mike said. I think that's what I heard, but it might be different. I can't remember the rule completely. I smiled wider. This was really great. Tommy looked increasingly irritated. But the best rule of all is number 3, Mike said. If you go out in the middle of the night to meet a crawler and you keep your eyes shut, the crawler will reward you for being so brave. Say a wish out loud and it will come true. That's the power of the crawler. My mind immediately raced with the possibilities. I had never seen a crawler in my backyard, but I'd never looked that closely in the middle of the night before. Maybe there was something crawling through my yard when the moon was high and the world was asleep. My house did back up to a forest, and there were a bunch of trees and bushes in my yard. A crawler would probably be easy to miss. It could squirm across the property line from the forest and then disappear without me even realizing it. "I gotta go," Mike said, hopping on his bike. "Don't tell anyone else about the crawlers. They don't like it if too many people know about them. I could get in trouble for telling you." With that, Mike pedaled away on his bicycle, the black patented leather on his sneakers glistening in the sun as his bike pedal spun faster. Tommy scoffed and rolled his eyes again. "I wish I was short. Then maybe my parents would buy me $100 shoes to make me feel better." I ignored Tommy's comment. My head was too preoccupied with the existence of crawlers. "He's so full of crap," Tommy said. "He's just playing a joke on you. Mike's never said anything smart in his whole life. You know he's in those special slow classes, right? There's no such thing as crawlers. Don't listen to him." But the thing was, I wanted to believe Mike. I wanted to believe in crawlers. So that night, I stayed up way later than I should have, just waiting at my window. I sat there with the lights off, just sipping on soda and trying hard to stay awake, gazing into my large backyard and out into the forest. I shone a flashlight on a comic book as I flipped through the pages, trying to keep my mind from sliding into sleep. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement from the edge of the woods. I clicked off my flashlight and dropped to my knees, my eyes barely peeking above the windowsill. I couldn't believe it. It was a crawler. I tried not to look directly at it, because I was nervous that I'd be breaking the rules. I dropped down below the windowsill for a few seconds, and then slowly rose, careful not to look too long. I carefully sneaked a look, but then my eyes dashed away. I didn't hold my gaze for longer than 2 seconds at a time. I didn't want to break one of Mike's rules. But the creature was there, dragging itself through my dewy yard near the edge of the forest. Pale skin, skinny arms and legs, very deliberate and stiff movements, like it was struggling to move, all the while drenched in darkness. It was a crawler. At least I think it was. It was impossibly dark outside. I thought I saw its head turn, and I quickly dropped down again, worried it might see me. This time, I didn't get back up. I slept on the floor until sunup. The next day, I told Tommy about what I saw, and he laughed at me and shook his head. "You can't be serious," he said. "I can't believe you're falling for this. It's just Mike playing a trick on you. I'll get to the bottom of this before you look even stupider." I didn't listen to Tommy. I wanted crawlers to be real. The next night, I was determined to see the crawler again. I snuck outside at midnight with a sleeping bag under my arm. I wanted that crawler to come back, and this time I wanted my wish. I unrolled my sleeping bag near the edge of the forest and climbed inside, shivering with a mix of fear and anticipation. No one would understand how I felt. I remember thinking, no one would be brave enough to do what I was doing. I was dying for something as fantastic as a crawler to actually exist. It'd be like my favorite kind of movie come to life. Crickets chirped, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the night. I laid in my sleeping bag under the stars for hours before I heard the noise, the rustling sound of a body being dragged across grass and dirt. I pinched my eyes shut and waited. The rustling came increasingly closer, and my eyes clamped shut even harder. The labored breath of whatever was inching closer grew louder. It must have been a few feet away when it stopped. And then I felt its hand gently rubbing my leg over the flannel sleeping bag. It stopped on my ankle and latched on tight. Its fingers felt unnaturally long, like they had wrapped themselves twice around my skinny leg. I wanted to look. I yearned to see this horrible creature before me, yet my eyes did not betray me. They stayed closed, even as the breathing of the crawler turned into a low growl. It was growing impatient. But then it dawned on me. I hadn't thought of my wish. In that moment, my mind blanked, and the grip on my leg tightened. I blurted out the first thing that popped into my head. "A dog!" I sputtered. "I've always wanted a dog! I wish for a dog!" The creature grunted and released the grip. My eyes burned with pain from the force of squeezing them shut. I listened closely as the rustling of the crawler's body slowly led into the forest, and the sounds vanished into the night. I jumped up, grabbed my sleeping bag, and hightailed it inside. The following morning, I was eating breakfast with my family when we heard a low whimper and scratching coming from the front door. It whined some more, and then it barked. I almost choked on my cereal. We opened the front door, and there sat an emaciated black Labrador. There was no collar, no form of identification. It dropped its head and looked at us with droopy eyes, Everyone immediately fell in love. "Can we keep it?" my little sister cried. "Oh, Daddy, please can we keep it?" My dad smiled. "We'll have to see whose dog this is, but if we can't find the owners, then I think we can keep it." I knew at that moment that we'd never find the owners. That dog would be ours. I finished breakfast and rode my bike like the wind to Tommy's house. I told him everything, but he was very disbelieving. He had that smug look on his face like he was just humoring me. "I hate to break it to you," Tommy said, "but that was Mike outside your house last night. I got the whole scoop from his older sister. Their parents have been fighting a lot. Yelling, throwing things, the whole deal. When Mike gets upset, he goes outside and crawls around the backyard. I guess he doesn't want to be around them, but still wants to hear what they're saying to each other. So he'll crawl around the yard, get close to different windows, and listen. His parents don't know that he does it. And sometimes," Tommy continued, "Mike will crawl around the yard even when his parents aren't fighting. That's what his sister says. Pretty weird." My heart broke that moment for Mike. That sounded awful. I couldn't imagine my parents fighting like that. Yet something still wasn't sitting right. "What about the dog?" I asked. "How do you explain the dog? My wish came true." Tommy shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe it's a coincidence. Or maybe Mike found a dog and brought it to your house as part of the joke. But Mike is the crawler. He has to be." Tommy made a good point. It made perfect sense that Mike was the crawler. I was ready to drop the entire situation, but I still wasn't entirely convinced. I needed to find out for sure. That night, I waited again. I lay in my sleeping bag near the forest's edge, hypnotized by the soundtrack of the night when the familiar rustling returned. I pinched my eyes shut again, ready to make another wish. This one would prove if the crawler was real or not. The crawler lurched on the ground towards me, and soon it was at my feet, gripping me with both hands this time. It pulled itself on top of me, dragging its body across mine. It breathed heavy and hard. Every movement it made was a colossal struggle. Its face was now inches from mine, and I felt its cold breath on my nose as it inhaled and exhaled, but my eyes remained shut. Its hands rubbed up and down on my face, like a blind man searching another face for recognition. There was no blurting out from me on this night. I knew exactly what I'd be wishing for. "I wish for my friend Mike's parents to stop fighting," I said. "I wish for them to not yell at each other anymore." The creature gasped and rolled off of me. I felt it lying next to me. Its breath quickened and intermixed with light sniffling. "I know it's you, Mike," I said, "and I do wish for your parents to stop fighting. You don't need to crawl around and spy on people anymore." I didn't look, but I felt the crawler roll up into a ball and cradle itself. I lay still, eyes always closed. I'm not sure how long we laid like that in the summer night, and eventually, even though I was paralyzed with a mix of sadness, apprehension, and utter terror, I fell asleep. I awoke to the sun rising. The crawler was gone. 3 days later, Mike announced to us that his parents were getting divorced. They were sick of the fighting, they were tired of the screaming matches, they brought out the worst in each other, and it was time for them to split up. As Mike told us the story, he gave me a knowing look. A moment passed between us, a moment of recognition. Mike knew that I was aware of his parents' problems, and I gave him a reassuring glance and a tiny smile. Mike wouldn't be crawling around his yard anymore. His parents' fighting would finally be over. My wish had come true. None of us talked about the crawlers again. We were kids and we moved on to other things. And talking about the crawlers just felt wrong. I didn't want to dredge up Mike's unhappy memories about his parents fighting and divorce. That would be cruel. So I just let it go. But 3 years later, the crawler came back into my life one last time, if only for an evening. I was 13, and I was up late watching a movie at my house with Mike. He was asleep on the couch, and I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I mindlessly gazed out the window and spotted something plodding on the ground near the edge of the forest. It couldn't be. I quickly turned away, hesitant to look directly at it. I thought hard about the rules of the crawler, but my mind was blank. What were they again? One popped into my head. Don't shine a light on the crawler. I switched off the kitchen light, and I made sure the backyard light was off. Our black lab sidled up to me, nosing at my leg. I reached down and scratched its head, and my dog moaned in appreciation. What was another rule? It had been so long. My head strained, and Mike's words came back to me. If you go out in the middle of the night to meet a crawler, keep your eyes shut. The crawler will reward you for being so brave. Say a wish out loud, and it will come true. I wasn't going out there this time. I didn't have any more wishes at the moment. My main wish had come true, and Mike was much happier once the shouting in his house had stopped. He had even shot up 7 inches in the past few years. He was no longer the shortest kid in our class. I glanced down at my dog, then back outside. I squinted hard, and I tried to make out the creature in the distance. I looked over at the couch, and Mike was still sleeping peacefully. But what was the third rule? I just couldn't recall. The crawler dragged itself methodically around the back of my yard. If the rules were true, I knew I shouldn't look closely at it. But I couldn't help myself. The crawler was as I remembered it, skinny and disjointed. A shimmer from the moon caught my reflection. It was the shoes. Those expensive shoes with the patented shiny leather. They gleamed and glistened. I squinted harder, and the creature crawled directly into the moonlight. We made eye contact, and we held it for several seconds. The creature that stared back at me was Mike. I dropped down to the kitchen floor, and I breathed in and out slowly. That crawler in my yard. It looked familiar, but it wasn't the Mike sleeping on my couch. It reminded me of 10-year-old Mike. Skinny, short, and weak Mike. He was even wearing Mike's special and expensive shoes. He was the only kid in school that ever had them. But Mike outgrew them 2 years ago, when he defied the doctor's predictions and started growing like crazy. Mike tossed that pair of shoes in the garbage. They didn't fit, he said. They made his feet hurt. Something wasn't right. My head was spinning. What was the third rule? What did Mike say to me 3 years ago when we were only 10? I scanned my brain and fumbled through memories, and then it bubbled up to the surface. If you go out to meet a crawler, you have to keep your eyes shut. Don't look at it. If you do, it will kill you and take over your life. It will mimic you. I rose and peeked out the window. The patented leather flickered once more at the edge of my lawn, and little Mike carefully slithered along the forest's edge. And at that moment, I was convinced that crawlers were real, and maybe Mike had just screwed up the rules. He said 3 years ago that he wasn't sure about the mimic rule, didn't he? Perhaps Mike had gotten the details wrong. Maybe the crawler doesn't kill you and then assume your life. Maybe it leaves you alive, makes a copy of you, and assumes your life. Then maybe you become the crawler. I looked out that kitchen window again, and I saw nothing. There was no movement, no plodding creature squirming near the forest. The crawler was gone. I returned to the living room, settled back into the recliner, and gazed at my friend. He slept peacefully, softly snoring. I shook my head, laughing at my foolishness. Maybe the 10-year-old me believed in the fantastic. The 13-year-old me didn't believe there were now 2 Mikes. One dozing on my couch and another living in some weird crawler limbo. That type of awesome creepiness just wasn't possible. There must have been a rational answer. But at that moment, I knew I would never mention it to anyone. The crawlers were just too sensitive of a subject. I would never say a word. I would never ask Mike to wade into his pool of hurtful memories. Because the Mike I've remained friends with to this very day has too much going for him. By his senior year of high school, my friend Mike was the tallest kid in the class, and the best athlete in the school. That Mike graduated college with a physics degree, high honors, and a perfect girlfriend who later became his wife. The Mike I know has a mother that got remarried to a great guy, and I couldn't be happier for that Mike and his family. But my mind always returns to the crawlers, and that's why I still gaze out my window in the middle of the night, looking for a glimmer of those old shoes from 20 years ago, looking for a 10-year-old lost in time. I sometimes wonder if my old friend Mike became a crawler. Poor, weak 10-year-old Mike, with the arguing parents, expensive shoes, and fantastic tales. I know it's stupid, but I do it anyway. And when I do, I feel like an awful person. I feel like I'm admitting that the real Mike would have never amounted to anything. That the real Mike would have remained short and weak for the rest of his life. That the real Mike is now just a lost, helpless creature. I don't want to think these things, but I can't stop myself. And every time I do it, I think about Mike's rules for the crawlers. I remember clearly those 3 rules he told me and Tommy on that lazy summer afternoon, all those years ago. Maybe Mike did get them wrong.
Water Puppet. Written by Emma Froh. Performed by Jason Hill. Some people call me a hero. I can't disagree with them, because it's actually kind of true. Believe it or not, I've saved a drowning man, pulled a girl from a burning building, and I've even saved a dog from being swept away by a nasty flood. My friends thought I was crazy, but I thought I was just exercising my humanity. That, and I was kind of an adrenaline junkie, was my guilty pleasure. I've been skydiving and bungee jumping on more than one occasion. I've jumped off the ledge of a huge waterfall hoping that I didn't hit shallow water. I've got a couple of scars to show for my endeavors. I don't really do the adventurous things that I used to anymore. Not after what happened. About 7 years ago, a couple of friends and I were just heading out from a New Year's party. It was freezing outside and we had to walk 6 blocks to get back to our dorms. We all started walking, dreading the next 20 minutes or so of minus 20-degree weather. "Hey, wait a minute," Jared said in his drunken stammer. "It'd be faster if we cut through the park." We all took a moment to think about it. The city made it a point to close the park down for some reason. Something about there being too many hazards, like falling trees or people drowning in the pond. Michelle cringed at the thought of walking through a knockoff cemetery. Me, Jared, and Alicia chuckled at her. The cold wind blew and stung my cheeks. It would save us an extra 18 minutes, so we decided to go through the park. We quickly made our way to the entrance, hopped the gate, and started walking. It was quite the beautiful place at 2 in the morning. The light from the moon glistened off of the frost that clung to the tree branches. I remembered walking through this park with my parents as a child, walking by the pond in the summertime to see tourists in their rented boats, enjoying the day. I was kind of excited to see what the pond would look like in the moonlight. It had been so long since I'd seen it, let alone in the middle of winter and in the dead of night. It would have been a very peaceful walk if Michelle and Jared weren't rambling on about who could drink more and not puke all over everybody. Since me and Alicia were the 2 most sober people of the group, we held them up and made sure they didn't slip on the path and crack their heads open. We approached the pond. It looked absolutely stunning in the moonlight, even better than what I remembered. We all stopped to take in the beautiful view when Michelle noticed something. "What the hell is that?" she queried, pointing to something out on the ice. We all looked closely and saw something that I'm pretty sure made all of our hearts jump into our throats. A little girl stuck out in the frozen wasteland. In a panic, we immediately ran towards the water's edge, cell phones at the ready. Alicia was the first to get anybody on the line. She frantically told the officers what was going on. All the while, the girl was just standing there, not moving, not shouting for help. "Are you okay?" I shouted, cupping my hands around my mouth to amplify my voice. She still stood there, in silence. While we panicked on the shoreline, I heard something faint but noticeable. I told everyone to be quiet and listen. I cupped my ear with my hand and listened in the direction of the girl. I couldn't quite make out what the sound was. Then it hit me. "The ice is breaking," I said. Someone had to go out there and get her now. My friends paced back and forth, wondering what to do now. If they weren't going to act on it, I was. I took a couple of deep breaths, braced myself, and then cautiously stepped out onto the ice. My trio of friends stopped pacing and saw that I was going out onto the pond. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jared asked in a somewhat shocked manner. "Don't go out there, please. Just wait until the police get here." Alicia beckoned, but I couldn't wait. If I did, she would fall through. The adrenaline was really flowing now. I couldn't help but smile just a little bit, let out a nervous chuckle. I tried to walk as fast as I could, but it seemed like I wasn't going fast enough. I tried to keep calm and proceeded to step cautiously. My eyes were fixated on the ice below my feet. "Wow, you are really crazy, aren't you?" I muttered to myself under my breath. I heard it crack again. The goofy grin I wore suddenly vanished. I stopped for a second only to notice that the ice wasn't cracking below me. I sped up just a little bit more, still watching the ice, making sure that I didn't make it crack in the process. As I got closer, I looked up and saw the girl with a little more definition. She was so pale, almost as white as the snow. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light from the moon, but it looked like she was shining. It looked like she was covered with ice or frost or something. I questioned whether or not if she was even alive at this point. But then how else would she be standing on the ice? I asked myself. Just then she let out a noise, something that was barely audible, but nonetheless a noise. I tore off my jacket and extended the warm article of clothing, hoping she would take it. "Don't worry, sweetie, everything's going to be all right," I said reassuringly. I was almost close enough to put the jacket on her, and that's when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. She wasn't standing on the ice. There was a patch of ice that I failed to see before, right behind her, that was broken. There was something protruding from the frigid water, holding her up. This pale, gray, spiked tentacle. My eyes widened as it squeezed her. That's when I came to the realization that it wasn't the ice that was about to break. When I heard her ribs snap and a wet gargle escape her mouth. As it squeezed her, blood dripped from her mouth and from the wounds that the spikes had made in her torso. I looked down at the gaping hole in the ice. To this day, I still don't know what the hell I saw. It was this pale gray thing, covered head to toe with pitch-black veins and jagged spikes covered its entire body. It had these huge crimson eyes bordered in black, and when it smiled, I saw 2 sets of rotted yellow fangs. I dropped my jacket. I could hear my heart pounding louder and louder. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't allow me. The corpse of the young girl was suddenly pulled through the hole that the creature had made, and I saw it swim off. My eyes darted back and forth across the ice, wondering where it went. It didn't even dawn on me that my friends were halfway across the ice when I saw them making their way toward me. I tried to yell at them. I tried to tell them to run, but all that came out was this pathetic whimper. They called my name, pleading that I hurry and come to shore with them before I fell through the ice too. I pushed past my fear and made my feet move. I ran as fast as I could, trying not to slip on the ice. "Run! Get the hell off the ice!" I warned them. They extended their hands to me and started walking my way again. "Come on, hurry up!" Jared yelled back. Just go! Get off the ice now!" I hollered back, desperately pleading for them to run. Just then, I felt cold water and a jagged edge at my ankle. I fell and bumped my head on the cold surface. Before I knew it, I was being pulled into the icy depths of the pond. When my body was submerged in the water, it felt like 1,000 daggers cutting into my skin. When the water hit my eyes, I thought the liquid inside was going to freeze. I immediately closed them. I tried not to scream from the pain. I had to conserve my air, but then I felt the tentacle cut into my ankle and another tentacle reach around my shoulder and squeeze. It kept pulling and pulling. It dislocated my shoulder. I couldn't do it anymore. I screamed, letting out almost all of my air. I thrashed, trying to break free. That only caused its spikes to cut deeper, allowing the frigid water to freeze my bloodstream even faster. I felt the warm tears behind my eyelids and the burning in my lungs. I tried to scream one last time, but it started choking me with its tentacle. The spikes tore into my throat and I opened my eyes again. Then I saw it. Those red eyes looked even more menacing now that it was up close. It wore a sinister smile as it licked my face. I started to feel lightheaded. This was the end. No, I thought to myself. I am not dying like this. I pushed past the pain in my shoulder, raised my hands to its mouth, and started widening its jaw. It squirmed, trying to shake me. I felt the tentacles loosen and its teeth cut into my hands. I looked up and saw 3 hands submerged into the water. I was so exhausted by that point, but I had to keep fighting. I kicked, I squirmed, and I did what I had in order to free myself. I used more force in its jaw, and I felt it crack. It let out this god-awful screech and let me go, and swam off into the cold darkness below. I could feel the water start to enter my lungs. I tried to swim to the surface, but I was getting fatigued. I was barely able to extend my hand toward my friends. The last thing I remember seeing was the light of the moon before everything went dark. I awoke the next morning to the beeping of a heart monitor. I was in the hospital. I was covered with the thickest, warmest blankets ever. I tried to move, but when I did, pain shot through my entire body. My head, shoulder, throat, ankle, everything was just throbbing from the pain. My friends walked into the room and saw that I was awake and rushed over. They told me that they were able to grab a hold of me, pulled me from the water, and rushed me to the hospital. They then bombarded me with questions pertaining to what pulled me into the water. "Trust me," I said, very weakly. "You don't want to know." "Well, are you going to tell the cops what happened?" Michelle asked. I decided to just tell the police that I was drunk and felt like doing something adventurous. Because, let's face it, would they seriously believe me if I told them some monster lured me out there and tried to kill me? Yeah, given the right state of mind, I wouldn't fall for it either. Needless to say, I don't partake in any more heroic acts. I also haven't been anywhere near water since. I've obtained a phobia of it, as you can well imagine. After college, me and my friends went our separate ways, did our own things. I have a family now, and so does Alicia. We get together sometimes for playdates, reminisce about old times. Some parts are left out. It doesn't really matter, though. I still have nightmares about that night, that thing under the ice. Its crimson eyes. I always tell myself that it happened a long time ago, and I try to put it behind me. It usually helps. Usually. Up until 2 weeks ago. Alicia had taken her boys, my son and my daughter, ice skating. She took them to her late father's house by the lake. It was just them there. When she brought them home, my son said something that sent a chill up my spine. He said that he saw a very pale girl standing on the ice. By her feet was a pale gray bump with 2 red dots.
The Sinister painting, written by Greye Spina, performed by Barry Bowman. The taxi drove off, leaving Funk on the Hoddesdon lawn, surrounded by valises. Funk was thinking it more than merely odd that Barkley, for whose coaching he'd come prepared to spend a month, had not met him as planned. He tried the screen door. It was hooked inside.
"Hello in there."
There was no response. The Hoddesdon farm lay drenched in a torpid lethargy for which it was obvious more than the July heat must be responsible. Within the house, no one stirred. On the surrounding fields, no one was abroad. Even the usual sounds of the farm animals were hushed. Funk was unpleasantly affected. Surely the entire household had not gone to meet his train and somehow missed it. He carried his traps to the stoop, crossed the yard to the barnyard, and hallooed again.
Hello!
He knew of old where Barclay's studio was, so he set off down the path toward the grateful shade of the woods. The gray stone walls of the old building soon glinted through the tree trunks and heavy foliage. A strong conviction possessed Funk that Barclay was not within. In fact, he found the studio door padlocked. He noted that the west window was rudely boarded up. He walked around the studio to the north. Here the trees had been cut down, and the studio wall was entirely of glass. He peered in with deepening curiosity, but apart from the usual litter of easels, painting paraphernalia and accessories, canvases in serried rows against the walls, his attention was almost immediately drawn to a painting propped against the south wall where the full light from the opposite windows poured in revealingly. Rum go. That never is Barclay's work, and he'd never let a student perpetrate such a monstrosity of hue and crude color. He pressed his face to the glass, cupping it against the outside light. That old man, it may be crudely done, but he's also absolutely horrible. His hands, they're dead hands, bloodless, waxen. Something about the way he's sitting there, drooping as if he hadn't the strength of himself to sit erect and was being held by something without that you can't see. I don't like that thing. It's ugly. There's something wrong with it. He said this last with conviction, and as he exclaimed, became aware of another gaze fixed upon himself. He snapped upright and wheeled quickly. Waiting patiently for him to finish his examination of the studio's interior stood a man in patched, stained blue overalls.
Well? Mr. Barclay's at the house, sir. You're Mr. Funk? I'm Mulcahy, Hoddeston's hired man.
All right. I'm coming. How did Mr. Barclay come to miss my train?
Well, we was all down to the police station, sir.
Police station? What's been going on here?
I found Mr. Oakey dead in the studio this morning, sir.
What?
Oh, there's something wrong in there, sir. I saw the blood on the old devil's beard.
Oh, snap out of it, Mulcahy. Are you referring to that picture?
I am that, sir.
Blood on the old man's beard? It's ridiculous. I saw none.
Oh, blood it was, sir. And the poor young man's was all drained out of him, sir.
Ha! This sounds intriguing. Blood on the old man's beard?
And dripping from his dead fingers, sir. And not one drop left in the corpse, sir. Blood all over the damned old devil's whiskers and his dead fingers, sir. Oh, Mary Mother.
Who did that painting?
A man by the name of Silva, sir. He's after being a cabinet maker, but he got to thinking he could paint, so he made that beauty back there. Devil fly away with him.
He sure can paint.
Oh, he's mixing something with his paint that only the devils from the pit can give him. Sir, the night before the poor lad was murdered, there was a fine canvas of Mr. Barclay's cut into ribbons, and Mr. Oakey's prize picture the same. What might that mean, along with the poor lad's being killed the next night? And Silva only getting honourable mention last week where he was looking for first prize.
Looks as if Silva had a motive. Life was stirring normally about the farm now, as if a ban of enchanted silence had been lifted. Funk could see Barclay's bulky body leaning over the valises on the front stoop. He hailed his friend and then asked Mulcahy hastily, "What did the police say?"
"Any one of us might have done it, sir. But the studio was locked from the inside, and there's no motive. And they can't figure where the poor lad's blood went, sir."
Back of the simple words pushed a dark significance of terrible things. Looks as if there were more here than appears on the surface.
Oh, right you are, sir. From now on, Tom Mulcahy wears a blessed medal next to his hide, day and night.
Funk met Barclay's welcoming hand with a heartening grip.
Sorry to have missed you, Funk, but this ghastly tragedy has dislocated all plans. I was fond of the boy. He had a gift, had he? I was looking forward to what he would do with color in not far future, and now...
Where's my room, Barkley? Funk gathered up his bags and followed the other painter up the front steps. Both men lighted cigarettes in silence. Barkley stared abstractedly from the window, while Funk unpacked rapidly, puffing clouds of smoke about himself as he tossed shirts, underwear, ties into the open bureau drawers. I want to know how Silva's paintings got into your studio.
So you're taking that attitude?
Well, anybody but a crass, materialistic jackass would.
Well, I didn't know you went in for that sort of thing. Well, I've no time for anything but painting. Just making a living takes most of my time these days, Funk.
Well, very little suffices for me. I'm too fascinated with studying the truths underlying the illusions of material existence. Not that I've gotten very far, but what I know, I know.
Then perhaps you can say what's unnatural about poor Harry's death. I know there's something wrong about it.
Something wrong? Yes, there's something wrong and uncanny about the lad's death. As to its being unnatural, well, there are many strange and little-known laws operating along lines so new to us. I believe the poor chap's death is due to an extremely interesting example of the transference of an evil will to power.
Well, I didn't tell the police what I felt lay behind this tragedy. I have no hankering to live in an insane asylum. Now I have faint hope that you may be able to appreciate the strangeness of my experience. Listen, Manuel Silva settled here a few years ago, and he's been doing well as a cabinet maker. Recently he learned that I got from $300 up for a canvas, and he thought this was an easy way to get rich. But I refused to teach him. You know I never take any but advanced students of decided promise. My refusal roused Silva's furious resentment. I've instituted an annual art exhibit in town. Silva entered 3 canvases to force my hand. They're rather terrible. One was a blacksmith, dark, sullen, sinister. He was hammering viciously at what appeared to be a battered crucifix. Another was a farmer slaughtering a wretched hog that somehow looked like a naked man. The butcher's face wore a too realistic grin of sadistic enjoyment as he wielded his bloody knife. The third was the painting you've just seen in my studio. Harry's entry took first prize. This was inevitable. I felt inclined to encourage a couple of young local artists, so I gave them honorable mention, and not to slight Silva's pride, I included him. The night before the canvases were removed, Harry and I were in the gallery, and he pointed out that someone had deliberately cut the honorable mention ribbon and Silva's canvas so that it hung in dangling strips. Odd that, eh? Oh, you're opening vistas. You're absolutely interesting. Well, I criticized Silva's paintings, observing that Harry was right when he said it gave him the jitters, but that in just that degree it possessed a touch of wild genius. Harry pronounced it ghastly to paint a hunched-up old man as dead as a doornail, his hands frightful, decomposing, yet sitting up there. Ugh! Silva's colors were crude, his drawing distorted. Just how it would be difficult to say, but wrong, you understand, just wrong. I said I dared not encourage Silva because of a very strange quality in his work, that's something wrong. And then we both nearly jumped out of our skins, for in the dusk behind us, someone broke into an ugly chuckle, and we turned to see a dark figure slouching out. It was Silva, and I realized that he'd heard me pronounce him an evil genius. Harry made light of my compunctions, but I was disturbed. We confronted the old man in the painting once more. As twilight gained the room, a murky dusk seemed creeping into the very canvas. Its shadows deepened. The old man merged into his dark background, all but his pallid face, his grayish beard, the waxen fingers dropping over his angular knees. It was wrong, entirely wrong. And then all at once Harry twitched my sleeve and exclaimed, "Let's get out of here." And we turned and plunged into the night, stricken by some subtle panic so obsessing that it was not until we were back at the Hoddesdon farm that we realized how foolish and unreasonable had been our flight.
Funk lighted another cigarette.
We went sketching next day, and Huddleston brought our canvases back to the studio. That night he told me that Silver had sent me one of his for a gift, so Harry and I went down to see which one. We lighted candles, and really we got a nasty shock. The flickering, inadequate candlelight made that old man appear more than ever an entity with a horrid existence, independent of his painted presentment. Oh, my God! Harry said, "My God," in a kind of comic dismay, and I knew instinctively that Silver was up to no good. He bore me malice. His very gift seemed to convey dire menace. In the pale candlelight, the old man's beard appeared to rustle stiffly as if his lips were parting under his bushy shelter. Of course I could not see anything, but I felt that I was seeing a pale dead tongue flick moisture over dry dead lips.
Oh, that must have been an odd sensation. You make it very clear.
Yes? Well, there's more of it, Funk. Oki and I went over our canvases to check on their return and good condition. We were satisfied. Just remember this point, will you? We padlocked the studio door and went off to bed. When we went in next morning, the padlock was undisturbed and all the windows locked on the inside. But one of my best canvases had been slit into ribbons, and Harry's, which had taken first prize, was completely demolished, even the frame. That last act of vandalism made me feel bad. I'd been sure the boy could cash in on his work, and he needed the money. And he took it like a Spartan, but he told me he was going to sleep in the studio that night, for he felt sure that Silver had done the damage. And I agreed, although I couldn't figure out how Silver could have gotten inside. So last night I left the boy there. He said he was going to hang something over the old man's gosh-awful face. I offered to stay with him, but he wouldn't have it. This morning,
Mulcahy told me.
It was ghastly, Funk. Mulcahy was howling blood at every jump he took. Blood, he yelled, on the old man's beard.
How about the coroner?
Harry had been dead for hours. Finger marks on his throat, every drop of blood drained from his body. Mulcahy had seen him through the north windows. I had to break the west window to get in. The coroner said at first he'd had a fit, but finally decided he'd been killed by a person unknown.
About the blood?
Mulcahy was right about it, Funk. I saw it, too.
It's not there now.
That's another strange thing. When I rushed over, I found poor Harry sprawling on the floor, his body all twisted in a grotesque, gruesome position, and so terribly white. As I threw myself on the floor beside him, something struck upon my inner ear. It was a sound, but such a sound. Even as I heard it, I knew I was hearing what could not be apprehended physically. I sprang to my feet and confronted Silver's hideous canvas. God, it was horrible. Oh, the painted old man sat there motionless, but it was a sinister restraint, Funk. I stared, stricken by a horror that affected me with nausea, for I saw then that someone had smeared that ancient's deadly pallor with crimson that crawled down the painted grey beard. The dead hands that hung over the angular knees were dripping, every pallid fingertip, with blood. Blood, Funk.
How do you know it was blood? I touched it. And then?
A ghastly thing came to pass. I did not see it. I felt rather than saw. I became aware with that inner sense of the movement of one of the old man's painted arms. It lifted with the jerking unevenness of an automaton, and passed across the stained grey beard. I say it moved. I felt it move. Yet at the same time I was aware that it was only painted, hence incapable of movement. It was something else behind it that actually moved. I find it almost impossible to clarify my intuitions, other than to say that while the painted figure did not stir, I was yet inwardly aware that it lifted one arm and wiped away the crimson from its beard. Then it reached out on either side to drag off that horrible drip from its waxen fingertips against the painted glass that reddened under them. Oh, God! It was more than horrible, because although the figure did not show movement to my straining eyes, yet I saw the crimson lifeblood of poor Harry disappearing from the canvas as those movements, which I felt rather than saw, took place. Of course, this explanation is inadequate.
Funk pushed the consumed tip of his cigarette to the fresh one he was holding between his thin lips. A cloud of smoke enveloped him.
Not adequate, my dear fellow. On the contrary, it is very enlightening. So clear that I believe we may yet punish the murderer of that poor lad. Oh, I'd give a year of my life to accomplish that. Well, I hardly think so much will be required, but you may have to sacrifice one or two of your canvases. We'd better get the rest of Oki's work over here, and Silva must learn that you are taking steps to protect Harry's work and your own. He must be informed that tomorrow night you yourself will sleep in the studio. That will bring him. You agree that it's Silva? I've no doubt about it, but not in propria persona. He's projecting his astral body through that hideous old man, and he's already made a grave error. What do you mean? He's permitted himself to savor human blood. Hence he cannot be permitted to continue. He's dangerous now. He will be yet more so, unless checked. I propose to do this in the only permanent way possible. We have no proof of his presence in the studio, Funk. Who would believe the intangible evidence of my experience? No one ordinarily, but I believe. And there's another person who will not only believe, but will furnish me with the means of putting a stop to Silva's murderous proclivities, without disturbing the authorities unduly. Wouldn't it be wise to return that picture to Silva, or cut it to bits and burn it? Later. You see, Silva has somehow learned how to transfer his will for evil to that creature of his own making. It's through the same creation that we must reach him and stop his criminal career before it's too late. You speak as if you knew what you were talking about, Funk. I can't just understand you, but I feel that you're somehow right. What do you wish done? Get Melkaye or Hoddesdon to clear out all Oki's canvases. Leave only a couple of your own that you don't particularly care about, so as not to stir Silva's suspicions overly. He'll imagine you're exhibiting. Then have Hoddesdon step in and tell Silva what happened to the canvases in the studio, and ask him to have his moved out of harm's way. That will appear a kindly impulse on your part, and he will reply that he'll send for his canvases in a couple of days. He'll figure on polishing you off by then. Agreeable thought, that. Now, you're going to lend me your roadster. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Be sure Sylvia is given to understand that tomorrow night you'll be sleeping in the studio. Under no circumstances, however, venture in there tonight. Tonight, Silva, or whatever wakens in the studio under the stimulus of his evil purpose, may have free play. But tomorrow night, I shall be there, not you. Oh, I won't permit your getting into a nasty situation, Funk. This isn't your affair. After all, Harry was my protege. It's up to me. Aha! Are you prepared to give effective battle to a painted demon, Barclay? Can you, through that painted thing, silence forever the intangible, distant malefactor? You can do such things? I shall know how to, before I return tomorrow afternoon. But how? I'm going to someone who knows. I shall demand the secret. She will yield it, I'm certain. I'm going to see Gwen Caradorn. Where have I heard that name? Possibly in connection with her published brochures. Her Reality of the Abstract is fairly well known. It's discussed everywhere. Quite likely. I seem to remember it vaguely. Now, how about your car? It was dusk when Funk returned on the following day. The seriousness and abstraction that wove a cloak about him struck Barclay's curious inquiries into silence. A certain high air about the younger artist forbade imperiously any break upon that lofty mood. Funk's first query was, had Silva been duly informed of the occupation of the studio that night? He knows. He told Hoddesdon that he would call for his unappreciated masterpiece in a couple of days. The words were significantly emphasized. I'd rather fancied he'd say that. He knows you'll be there tonight. Hoddesdon told him if there were any further trouble, I'd sleep there tonight on to protect his painting. Excellent. And was there any? Yes. Last night the 2 canvases I'd left were demolished. Good. He'll be expecting you to sleep there tonight. Let's have supper, then I'll run into town and fetch Miss Caradorn. She insists upon coming out. The time was too brief to prepare me to handle the situation single-handed. That's extraordinarily kind of her, Funk, but if she's to be at the studio tonight, why not I? She would have handled it alone, only that
Sorry, I can't be more explicit, but she bans discussion of herself unless she decides to come out into the open, which she rarely does. Well, wait until you meet her, if she permits it. You'll understand then. But believe me, she is worthy the highest respect and admiration a human being could expect. Funk did not have to drive to town. Between dusk and dark, a shining dark blue car with a special delivery body slipped into the driveway. From the limousine-like front, 2 uniformed men alighted and walked to the rear of the car. There were wide doors there, which they proceeded to open. They withdrew with the utmost care a strange anachronism, a blue and black and gold decorated sedan chair, small and delicate. They placed themselves between the shafts and started toward the farmhouse. Funk exclaimed and sprang down the steps to meet the odd equipage. He bent over what was obviously an extended hand, white in the dusk. Barclay, staring, saw the young artist touch his lips to those extended fingers. A child's high, shrilly, sweet voice gave an order, and the chair-bearers carried the sedan chair toward the barnyard. Funk followed, calling back as he went. "See you tomorrow morning, Barclay." With that he disappeared after the chair into the soft darkness beyond the barnyard. Barclay felt that he could not sleep. He was intensely irritated that Gwen Caradorn should have sent a child to take her place in what he felt must be a post of danger. He went down to the shining automobile and walked around it with curiosity. The rear doors had been closed, and nothing marked it as out of the ordinary, save, perhaps, the expensive type of shock absorbers for a delivery body, and, of course, what looked very like a periscope set in the top, as much out of place as was a modern child in a sedan chair. He sat at his window, fell asleep there in his chair, and did not waken until Mrs. Hoddesdon tapped at his door, calling that Mr. Funk and the little girl had returned. She volunteered that the little girl was a perfect little French doll. Barclay took the stairs, 3 at a stride. In the hall, Funk sat on a hassock, which brought his face slightly below the level of the small, oval countenance of the child, who sat sedately on the half-chair. Barclay noted with an artist's appreciation the bloom on her dazzling cheeks, the straight nose, the richly scarlet mobile lips. He approved the curling black lashes, finely penciled arching eyebrows, sleek black bobbed hair. Her creamy silk dress, rather long than worn by most children of her age, apparently about 6, was smocked in a knowing fashion with bright colors. Her feet were inappropriately encased in high-heeled French slippers. All this the artist in Barclay captured at a glance, just as he took in the beauty of the slender, tiny hands, of the taper fingers, and the eloquence of every gesture. A strange and unusual child, this. His leaping footsteps brought upon him a lifting of fringed eyelids, and what he felt shrinkingly was a glance of indifference. He stopped short at the foot of the staircase, abashed at this disdainful glance. He knew all at once why this child's frock was longer than customary, why her tiny feet wore adult-style footgear, why sophistication animated those taper fingers. The cobalt-blue eyes that regarded him from the child's elfin face were the eyes of a grown woman. They were the informed eyes of one who had passed through the fires of varied experiences, the eyes of one who had gazed unafraid upon unveiled mysteries. The child was not a child, but was an exquisite midget, a creature set apart from the entire world by her miniature proportions. Funk sprang up, caught the other man's hand, and drew him down to the hassock, himself sinking upon the floor so that both men's faces were below the level of the midget's. "Barclay, Miss Caradorn permits me to present you."
Honored, Miss Caradorn."
Barclay sat, still confused, under the keen gaze of those faintly derisive blue eyes. He understood it after a minute. She was touched with amusement at his discomfiture. An elfish smile twitched at one corner of her scarlet lips, and she actually turned away those 2 shrewd eyes as if to spare Barclay's feelings, a kindly gesture which did not serve to tranquilize him, for there was just a touch of condescension in her half-smile. "Mr. Funk has been showing me these canvases from your studio. I would very much like that snow scene. It is charming. If you will tell me the price."
I would feel honored if you would accept it as a proof of my gratitude for your having come here."
You're anxious to learn the outcome of last night's plans? Suspended in the bosom of her frock by a slender platinum chain was a platinum whistle which she put to her lips and sounded. At once the bearers of the sedan chair came up the steps and into the hall, holding the chair close to their mistress. Like some bright bird, so airy and graceful was her lithe movement, she seemed to fly from her chair into the sedan's shelter. She waved one tiny hand. The bearers took their light burden outside, slid it into place in the rear of the waiting automobile. They mounted into the front, and the car slipped noiselessly away down the road, bespeaking the many-cylindered motor by its very silence and power.
So that strange little thing is your wonderful Gwen Caradorn? Why didn't you warn me?
Funk lighted a cigarette hastily and began surrounding himself with smoke. Why didn't I? Because she won't be talked about. She's proud and sensitive. She considers her miniature body the ultimate of human perfection and won't permit its comparison with what she considers our gross bodies. And she's abnormally proud of her brain. She has reason to be. I think it's the most highly developed I've ever known. As an oculist, she's the seventh daughter of a seventh daughter. You're anxious to know about last night. She's forbidden me to divulge details, but I may tell you briefly that Silva will never again repeat his evil act.
He was there, then, last night?
Not in propria persona, but his familiar was already locked in with us when I bolted the door behind Gwen and myself.
What do you mean?
Let's go down to the studio. It's easier to understand when you've seen things with your own eyes. The telephone rang. Mrs. Huddleston ran out of the kitchen and answered it. An expression of horror settled on her placid face.
Manuel Silva's been found dead with a knife wound in his throat.
Funk beckoned Barkley silently, and the two hurried across the barnyard and into the woods. With the key Barkley had loaned him, Funk unlocked the padlock. He pushed the studio door open. Words seemed superfluous. Spread on the floor lay a painted canvas figure, pinned down by a knife through its throat. The edges of the canvas were sharply defined, as if just cut out of the painting, leaning against the south wall, with a neatly trimmed vacancy in its center. Barkley stared, closed his eyes convulsively, and then stared again. I couldn't have done it alone. She furnished the power. She'd have done it herself, but she's too... he was too tall. Barkley stared motionless. He was absorbing the details of a bizarre thing which confirmed him in his hasty resolution to burn Silva's painting without delay. The empty space in the painting distinctly outlined a drooping, seated figure. The painted canvas shape lying on the floor, pinned down by the knife through its pallid painted throat, could have filled that vacancy twice over. It was a full-length, standing figure.
Chilling tales for dark nights.